For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Madi. Author Garth Greenwell joins me to discuss his book, What Belongs to You. Tell us a bit about what your book, What Belongs to You, is about.
So the book it's narrated by an American living in Sofia, Bulgaria, where he teaches high school. And the book is about a relationship between him and a younger Bulgarian man whom he meets in a public toilet beneath Sofia's National Palace of Culture and whom he pays for sex. And it's about how that relationship becomes kind of increasingly complicated and difficult for the narrator.
This is your debut novel. Tell us about your research and writing process for this book.
Well, the inspiration of the book really comes from the 4 years that I lived in Sofia, from 2009 to 2013. And it especially comes from the conversations I had with LGBT people there, and being reminded from those conversations, of what it was like to grow up as a gay person in Kentucky in the American South in the early 1990s. And so it was that connection between those two very different places and times that really made the book happen.
You have already received rave reviews for the book from authors, the New York Times and the New Yorker. What is your response to the acclaim you've received?
Enormous gratitude. I think anyone who cares about books and who watches sort of the world of books knows that there's a great deal of chance involved in whether a book gets any attention or not. And so I feel extraordinarily lucky. And I'm also grateful, that the book in some way seems to have found a place in the world. I really was not at all confident that it would. And then, the challenge really is to forget all of that in order to be able to write the next book. Yeah.
Take us through the character development of your main characters, Mitko and the narrator.
Yeah, so there really are only two major characters in the book. There's the narrator, and the middle section of the book really goes into his childhood and sort of what it was like and the primary relationships he had, especially with his father, that kind of shape the person he becomes. And then the other character is Mitko. And, Mitko, it was difficult to try to be true to that character because we never get to see his consciousness. So we only see him as filtered through the eyes of the narrator. And yet I knew that if the book was going to be successful, he had to be available to the reader as an object of sympathy and of emotional investment, independent of sort of his role, like what the narrator feels about him. And so it was, this attempt to sort of find ways in which the reader could sort of guess at his experience and to give the reader information about Mitko and what he's experiencing that the reader might interpret differently from the narrator. So sort of I worked very hard to try to describe, like in a particular scene, to try to describe like how Mitko moves his body, how he makes gestures, what's happening on his face, so that the reader can sort of, so that there can be multiple stories for the reader. The story that the narrator is telling as he tries to understand Mitko, and then the reader's own experience of the character.
You don't use names in your book besides that of Mitko's. Why is that? So
Mitko is the only named character. And in part, that's because, I do think he's the most important character in the book. In the very beginning of the book, in the first scene, when the narrator first meets Mitko, they introduce each other, and it turns out that Mitko can't pronounce the narrator's name. So the narrator is kind of stripped of his name. It's unpronounceable in Bulgarian. And that seemed right to me, that sort of the narrator would lose his name as he begins this journey that the book recounts with this man. But then the other characters don't have names because, I want, it feels to me like Mitko having a name is like a spotlight, kind of. And the spotlight, I hope makes him really vivid and kind of available to the reader and present. It also, spotlights are interesting, I think, because, it's a place of privilege, because it is, he's important and it's sort of being the desired object. And it's also a space of exposure and vulnerability. And that seemed to me true to Mitko's place both in the narrator's life and in the society at large.
What are the major themes of the book?
So the book is called What Belongs to You, and I think it is a book about belonging. It's a book that engages with questions of sex work, and I think, questions of sort of what belongs to us that we can sell to another, what belongs to another that we can buy for ourselves, and what the limits of that are engaged in the book. And then I also like the word belonging because it has the word longing in it, and I think this is very much a book about longing. And it's a book about this very solitary person, the narrator, and his great desire to form human connections across the gulf of a solitude that is necessary to him. So that maybe longing, belonging, solitude. Yeah, it's hard to think of sort of the key words. Yeah.
Are you trying to highlight specific issues through the book, and if so, what are they?
It was not my intent. My intention was really to write this relationship in a way that was true, moment to moment, to the two men, these two characters. I do think issues are raised, and I think the main issue is, both Bulgaria today and Kentucky in the early 1990s are places where queer people are taught a single lesson about their lives, which is that their lives lack dignity and their lives lack value. And, I wanted to write a book about the communities that queer people form in places like that. And I also wanted to explore what sort of a kind of queer subjectivity is like in this moment in certain very privileged parts of the world where LGBT people do have rights and protections. And this particular, my narrator, it is a book about shame and about having been taught shame as a child, but it's not the same shame as you find in a book like James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room from 1956, whenever that book was written. It's a different kind of shame because my narrator has spent decades as a queer activist and sort of, immersed in the language and the arguments of queer activism. He knows that the lessons he was taught about his life as a child are false. He knows that they're bankrupt. And yet, he will never get to be a person who was not taught those lessons. And so that moment of queer subjectivity does seem to me sort of an interesting thing to explore in literature because it is so vexed and at war with itself. And it seems to me that sort of literature and art in general is always made up out of conflicting feelings. And that our particular moment in gay subjectivity seems to be made up out of conflicting feelings.
Tell us about the significance of the title, What Belongs to You?
So the title of the book it's actually a quotation, although there's no reason anyone would ever know that unless I told them so. It's a quotation from Thomas Mann's great novella, Death in Venice. And in Death in Venice, which is about an older man's, it's not exactly analogous to my book, it's a much older man's obsession with a very young boy. And as part of this, he goes to a barber to get his hair cut. And the barber sees he's in love and convinces him to let him dye his hair and to put makeup on him to make him look young. And the barber says to him, "Permit me to restore what belongs to you." And that phrase, what belongs to you, it feels to me, it's not just about age, it's not just about youth. It's sort of full of longings of all kinds. And so, I hope that in the beginning of the book, the title engages with some of those questions we mentioned about sex work and sort of what does belong to us that we can sell, et cetera, and the question of commodification of bodies and of persons. But I hope by the end of the book it's become an even broader question than that. As the narrator really is asking himself whether it's possible for him to belong to any person or to any place, or whether there's any place that he belongs, in that other use of the word. So I hope that it's a title that, sort of with each section of the book becomes more complicated. Yeah, I hope.
What do you hope people will take away after reading your book?
I do think, the value of any work of art lies in how people use it for their own lives. And so, in some way I wouldn't ever want to limit, that sense. I sort of see whatever anyone finds in the book that's useful to them is what I want them to walk away with, after having read it. I guess I would say, I think there are places in the world like Bulgaria, and I think everywhere in the world there are people, there are marginalized communities that are often treated by a sort of mainstream culture or a dominant culture as being uninteresting or as lacking in value. And I hope that not just this book, but everything I would ever write would fight against that idea and would argue instead that literature is a way of looking, and it's a way of looking that invests you in a place emotionally and ethically, and that there is no place in the world and there is no group of people in the world who are not deserving of that investment.
That was author Garth Greenwell discussing his book, What Belongs to You.